Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel. It's Afrocentrism critiqued here, and this is my first narrated video in which I will be giving a general overview of the genomic components within Africa's various population groups. This presentation will focus on the autosomal as well as the Y-chromosome. Before I begin, I just want to say thanks to all my subscribers, and I appreciate all those people who are still following me since the days of my first few channels I created. And to those who are not subscribed, I invite you to join us as we are all here to increase our knowledge and understanding of African culture, heritage, history, genetics, and much more. I will try to keep all my narrations as short as possible, and only focus on what is important. Anyway, without further ado, let's get right into it. Alright, so I have included on the side here the African groups that have the highest ancestry of their specific component. As we progress, I will explain the abbreviations used for the various ancestries. Okay, so firstly we have the Somalis. As we can see, they out of all the Cushitic populations have the highest HOA, or Horn of African-derived ancestry. The reason is Somalis have remained relatively homogeneous from practicing centuries of endogamy, and they also lack the significant Omatic as well as Southern Arabian admixture which is prevalent in the highland Ethiopians. OT here stands for other, which is a placeholder for any non-African ancestry in recent history, by that I mean non-prehistoric. On this point, I would also like to highlight that this HOA component is itself a mixed one from around 6,000 years ago and is associated with a Neolithic back to Africa migration from the Levant. Don't worry too much about that, as we will be covering the ancient admixtures towards the end of the video. Continuing, next is the Afari. So Afars are part of the same lowland East Cushitic language phylum as Somalis. Their secondary elements are simply a result of living close to the Abyssinians. Next to them we have the Beja, who speak a branch of North Cushitic. This is based on samples of the Beni Amars, because Bejas do actually differ by region and subgroup. The others being Hodendawa, who have a bit more N4 Nilotic, and the Bishari, who have more Na2, North African 2, which is related to Coptic Egyptians. The ones from Eritrea tend to have the most HOA, however even they have a chunk of ancestry from Arabian Bedouins that migrated into the Sudan, probably a group similar to Rashaida. Down here we have our second reference population, who are the Ari. They reside in southern Ethiopia and are an Omatic people. These are the blacksmiths, who are virtually fully Omats, while the Ari cultivators tend to have slightly more elevated Horn of African ancestry from residing near Cushites for so long. They are important to highlight because, as you can see, there are many Ethiopian groups who carry a portion of ancestry from them, like the Walata from SNNPR, Southern nations, and nationalities and peoples region in Ethiopia, which is the part of the country with the highest Omatic ancestry. Some is even found outside that province, as far as the Borana Oromos of Kenya. Next, the Habesha. So they are of course mostly of Cushitic origins, but do as well have no more than 1/3 of their ancestry derived from Yemenites and Sumo, which stands for Omatic. The difference between the two main Ethio-Semitic groups is that the Amhara tend to have more elevated Omatic, while the Tigrayans have slightly more Middle Eastern, being in closer proximity to where the Sabaean migration occurred around 3,000 years ago. Overall, owing to their primarily Cushite makeup, they are considered to have all simply language shifted to South Semitic. The next two are the proxies for Nilotic-related ancestries and Western African. The Dinka and Yoruba peoples are used respectively. The Dinka are a South Sudanese tribe, who are related to the Nuer and Shilluk. All Nilotes carry some Western African DNA because of the recent exchanges with Zanda Bantu groups, but also a much older one which will be shown later. Moving on, we have the Maasai and Tutsi people of southeastern Africa. The HOA genes from these tribes are closely related to South Cushitic groups like the Iraqi. This ancestry is derived from the pastoral Neolithic cultures of Kenya and Tanzania, which were created by movements of Cushitic pastoralists going southwards. I will definitely be touching upon exactly how these migrations took place in future videos. What should be taken away from this though is that both these groups, including the Samburu, Bani Amulanji, Banyankol and Bahima, are a product of Rift Valley Cushites. Other related Nilo-Saharan peoples like the Turkana and Kalenjin too carry varying levels of Cushitic ancestry as well, but at much lower levels. In classical anthropology, all these people were referred to as being Nilo-Hamitic. They would then later acquire ancestry from the Bantu expansions. Alrighty then, the Yoruba are typical West Africans in all regards, similar to the Igbo, Esan, Mandinka, and others. Hausa are genetically West African firstly, but they do have a real Nilotic ancestry which is secondary, unlike other Chadic speakers in Central Africa who tend to be more Nilotic, basically the reverse of this. The Fulani's ancestry reflects their lifestyle. They are the most widespread nomadic community on the continent. They are mostly West African as they expanded from Senegambia moving eastwards. They do as well have a large portion of NA1, which is Berber Amazi related, and of course some Nilotic being Sahelians. By the way, I will explain the distinctions between North African 1 and North African 2. We now move to Northern Africa to discuss the Maghreb and Egypt. Representing NA1, North African 1, which is Maghribi ancestry, is the Sahrawi of Western Sahara, Morocco and Mauritania. Personally, I'm not looking to get into the politics of that dispute. While the Hassaniya Arabs do claim some Yemeni roots, possibly due to Islam, they are overwhelmingly indigenous North Africans, an Amazi people, and even have some of the highest Ibero-Maurusian genomes. The Ibero-Maurusians were essentially a Paleolithic North African population, which I will touch on towards the end of the presentation. Over here, the Egyptians are the proxy for NA2, North African 2, because Copts and Berbers actually have differing ancient components to a certain degree, though both are partly a result of Eurasian back to Africa movements. The OT or other in Egyptians is mostly Near Eastern Levantine from Hyksos immigrants during the Middle to Early New Kingdom, potentially a tiny portion of Southern European, and more recently, from Arabians. Egyptians too have a portion of Kushite ancestry from their thousands of years of close relations with Beja and Ababda tribes, derived from the neighboring Kushites during Egypt's long history, in which I have an entire video being worked on, so all these nuances will be elaborated on further. Their more southerly neighbors, the Nubians, also have Horn of African ancestry, but at higher levels. They are still having a Nilotic component. Overall, but due to their location and regional history of contact with Egypt and the nomadic Cushitic peoples like the Medjay Kingdom, have since accumulated substantial Eurasian admixture over hundreds of years, and their OT is from movements of late-period Egyptians and the Arab conquest of Sudan. Down here we have the Tebu, also known as Goran. They are Nilo-Saharans from Chad and do have a North African admix, but to be honest, with tribes like the Tubu, it is best to focus on the simpler autosomal results that I will showcase, because pinpointing their exact ancestral composition is kind of inconsistent. We need a much more focused study, in my opinion, than what has so far been released about the Tubu genome, so take this partly with a grain of salt. As for the Moroccans, the ones in the north have a much higher Iberian component, which is both due to recent events, but also old migrations crossing the Strait of Gibraltar. Southern Moroccans tend to have more West African genes. These are those who mixed with the Ganawa and Haratin. The OT portions are also from the Arab tribe migrations to the Maghreb. We spoke a bit about the Walata already. Being from southern Ethiopia, they have Omatic DNA in abundance. The Agorbilan, these were essentially the indigenous Cushitic tribes who inhabited the Ethiopian and Eritrean highlands before the movement of South Arabians, and they still retain their Cushitic languages. Nonetheless, even they still have a portion from the Middle East. Over here, similar to the Anwak, the Gumus are a Nilotic tribe who live in the southern parts at Gambela and Benishangul provinces, and they are largely similar to South Sudanese, but do have around a quarter Omatic. Below, in contrast to the Tutsi that we saw, the Hutu are overwhelmingly of Bantu stock, that is West African. They generally have insignificant levels of Cushitic and Nilotic, even though they reside with their Tutsi and Batwa neighbors. The Kikuyu are northeast Bantus, and when Bantu people were expanding, they did intermix with various Nilotic and Ethio-Somali groups who were in Tanzania and Kenya prior. To end this slide, we have Benadiri, related to the Barawa, they are simply modeled as being derived from Middle Eastern, Arab and Persian, and also South Asian, basically Indians, who settled in Hama, the Somali word for Mogadishu, and intermixed with the indigenous Cushitic Africans. They do have a minor West African admix from Swahili-related people or Mushonghuli. Moving forward, I know there will be some contrarians when I say this, but this is what the science shows. So, while not being offensive to their identity, the Falasha are proven beyond a doubt to be later Jewish converts, and not actual Hebrew Israelites. They have been shown time and time again to cluster with their fellow Horn of Africans, and are genetically identical to them, only slight differences within the same related components. They are without a doubt indigenous Cushitic Africans, not the descendants of Near Eastern Jews. Continuing, let's talk about the Rendili who live in Marsabit County, Kenya. They are very similar to the Somalis and Gare, it's just they dress like Nilotes as they have been culturally Niloticized. What is unique about them is they have retained many of the pre-Islamic customs and religions like Wakhism. Nevertheless, if you were to see them in regular clothes, many look so much like Somalis it is astonishing. Their languages even have 70% mutual interchangeability, both being Somaloid dialects, similar branches of the Omo-Tana tree. What differs them is a portion of Nilotic ancestry from mixing within, particular the Sambaris. Yemenis are a Near Eastern people native to the Arabian Peninsula. They tend to not have more than 10% HOA, and their West African is from the historic trade along the Southeast African coast. Now of course these will differ depending on region, but this profile is average, but it tends to best fit the northern Yemenis most. I believe even the Hadrami, Meri, and Sokotri in the south may vary only slightly compared to general Yemen. Alright, here we have Spaniards from Andalusia. With the NA1 around half of it has no relation to the Moorish movement whatsoever, but like with the Moroccans who have some Iberian ancestry it is much older. With that being said, we move on to the Cape Verdeans. The island country was originally uninhabited, but became a nation founded by the Portuguese. They are mulattoes, with their ancestry reflecting both European and West African, with a minor Maghrebi element. We conclude this section with Black Americans. African Americans are an amalgamation of various Western African coastal tribes, Sahelians, and to a lesser extent Bantus. All of these tribes and communities makes up the West African component they have. And of course, the majority of the OT other they have is Western European, and a small percent of Amerindian, Native American. We now arrive at the more simplified autosomal breakdown, which is essentially full genomic sequencing, and clusters all related ancestries into those originating from within Africa represented by AF, Sub-Saharan African, and that which is a result of movements of Western Eurasian populations into the continent, shown as WE. So let's do a quick breakdown. Horners derive most of their West Eurasian from two migrations mentioned before, the Levant and South Arabia. Though with the Beja they acquired it from the former like most other Kushites, but their additional one is coming from Arab Bedouins a few hundred years ago instead. Their African ancestry is derived from various East Africans, probably Proto-Nilotic, and some may be from East African hunter-gatherers like Mota. Ari cultivators do have a portion of Eurasian ancestry, and with the Habesha it would probably be much higher, but as you saw, they have an Omatic ancestry which pushes their Eurasian levels down. To speed things up I won't be mentioning everything, just what is relevant. Feel free to pause the video at any time to digest the data. In Sudan, the difference between the north and south is the much higher Western Eurasian ancestry in the northern Sudanese tribes. Maasai get theirs by proxy from their Cushitic roots. Darfurians, though being northern Sudanese, are very similar to Nilotics in that they are largely Saharan Africans. The Kunama Noro of Eritrea are Nilo-Saharan remnants in the Horn of Africa, but they have mixed a bit with Habesha, hence their Eurasian levels. Luhya pick about 5% Eurasian, very low levels, and just because they simply neighbor the Pokot, Kalenjin, and Maasai, and surprisingly they are some of the purest Bantus in that part of the world. Within the northeast Bantu grouping you will have your Gikuyu, Chaga, Meru, Kamba, Tita, etc., and some clans within these tribes can be quite similar to the Nilo-Hamites in terms of their West Asian ancestry. Batutsi, Bahima, Bani-Amulanji, Banyanokol, that's the average they carry, as they are derived partly from the southern Kushites. As for the Levantines, this is a Lebanese Christian woman. They have much less AF than the Muslims. Next. Yes, the Yoruba. Now with them it is the ones in the north, in parts of Kwara state, who have just under 10% Eurasian, and most of this is either from exchanges with the Pule herders in the region, as it used to be part of the Sokoto Caliphate, or more likely in my opinion from the Paleolithic Ibero-Maurusians. West Africans do trace some of their ancestry to a group related to them called Kifians and Tenerians. Hausa, the ones not mixed with Fulanis, have low levels of Eurasian ancestry, and their partial Nilotic roots also low as any ancient Eurasian gene flow from the Green Sahara that may have entered West Africans thousands of years ago. Fulani, of course, being partly Berber, get their West Asian component from possibly a Sanhaja group, namely Sahrawi or Tuaregs. Although there is also evidence pointing to an older, as well as more recent admixture date in the Fula people. Now with the southernmost Berbers, a lot of their AF is simply from the fact that they have high levels of Ibero-Maurusian genetics, and the Paleolithic Berbers or Tafralt did have a large chunk of their genomes being derived from ANA, ancestral North Africans, which were similar to Yoruba or Hadza-like. Okay, North Moroccans have less sub-Saharan African ancestry because of additional Southern European admixture. The Tubu have no more than 30% Eurasian, which is firstly from an ancient back migration, and additionally, a small portion is from recent movements of Amazi tribes according to the data. Yemenis, it comes mostly from East African trade, and during the height of the Kingdom of Aksum from Ethiopians. When it comes to the Egyptians, they have a similar clinal zone of sub-Saharan African admixture if one was to go from, let's say, North to South Morocco, so it depends on the region in Egypt. It is also true that not all Upper Egyptians will be on the high end and vice versa. For Lower Egyptians, the regions are very fluid, but generally the gradient is a good gauge, north to south. The sub-Saharan admixture probably peaks with certain Saidis who live in cities within the Aswan governorates like Edfu, while it will be likely lowest in the governorates of Alexandria. Quickly to finish up, representing basically a full Western Eurasian population are the Basque people of France. Greek Cypriots on the other hand are similar to Levantine Christians in terms of their African levels, and other Southern Europeans do not have more than Cypriots, but comparable small amounts have been detected in Sardinia, Calabria, and Portugal. Arab Bedouins tend to be around 10%. The Nama in Namibia, South Africa get it from Cushitic Africans, same with the Sandor and Hadza. Remember, you had southern Cushitic agro-pastoralists living in Tanzania all over that region, and a remnant still remain today, the Gorowa, Burunj, Alagwa, and as mentioned Iraqal. That ends this section. Now we have reached the Y-chromosome. Y-DNA represents less than 1% of an individual's total ancestry, same with the mtDNA, the maternal markers. However, they are both valuable for tracing movements of people across the regions of the world. So, Somalis of course have mostly the North African-derived E1b1b, branch EM78, and their subclade EV32 comes from parent EV12, which peaks in southern Egyptians, the Saidis. And their next most frequent is T, which is Iranian farmer-related. Both the E and T entered the Horn of Africa at the same time in my opinion, and the minority J frequencies are from recent contact with Arabs. Afar Saho likewise have a similar North African-derived paternal marker, but they have EV22 and EV6 instead, and a high J from ancient Yemenites, and the T is from living in close proximity to Somalis, the Der clan in Djibouti. As for the Beja, they are half E1b1b, and they were paternally influenced substantially by those Arabian Bedouins we spoke about with an astonishing 40% J, and a minor A, seeing as they neighbored Nilotics for thousands of years. Habesha are having typical E1b1b Cushitic Y DNA, but some of the E1b1b is EM34, which is high in Omanis, Saudis, Yemenis, and some Jews. Of course the haplogroup J from Sabaeans, and they have A as well, which we shall see is high in the Beta Israel. With the Nubians lots of J is expected, around half is from the ancient Egyptians, the other Bedouins. The R1b is subclade V88, which is the most common clade in Africa, found in many different people both north and south of the Sahara. They also got E1b1b and various traditionally nilotic markers. In contrast, we see the Dinka are largely having paternal roots with Africans south of the Sahara. The Maasai's E1b1b correlates with their Horn of African Cushitic ancestry, nothing surprising, similarly with the Tutsi. Iraq will still have clear signs of being derived from the Horn, because of the high E1b1b and T. Although, just to point out, the E1b1b in these three and others like the Datuga Barabeg are more to do with these southerly Cushites. The main marker is EM293, rather than EM78 clades from Eastern Cushitic speakers. Senegalese are typically having West African E1b1a, but they also have E1a which peaks in the Dogon. It is another clade of macrohaplogroup E. Hausa and other Chadics have very high R1bV88, highest in Chadic speakers is found in those from Cameroon via founder effect. With the Fulani, it ultimately depends on where they inhabit, so this is a compilation of all the various samples on Fula people. They tend to have mostly E1b1a, not shocking as they come from the Senegal, Mauritania, and Gambia area, but some do have notable T, R1b and E1b1b. Here with the Gumus, they are mostly sub-Saharan haplogroups, even more than Dinka, which surprised me. Oromo are similar to Somalis, having a lot of E1b1b, some J, and the rest A were later. Similarly, their paternal haplogroups correlate with their roots carrying both Horn of African and Omatic ancestries. As I was saying, Ethiopian Jews have very high A, but the A in Ethiopia is a bit different to the one found in Khorasan and Nilotic populations, as it has a very ancient presence in the region. Another thing, just to point out, the E1b1a here is EM329, which is a specific clade of EV38 E1b1a separate from EM2, which is the one found in West Africans. It is tightly restricted to Ethiopia, and high amongst certain Omatic peoples in the south. Progressing, Bantu Ke means Bantu Kenya, and they are largely E1b1a, with a portion of E1b1b from Cushitic groups. With the island of Madagascar, Malagasy are firstly a mix of Austronesians and Bantus, and their paternal ancestry clearly reflects that. Continuing, Pygmies have the very prime Val B haplogroup, and some E2 which is high in Alern Nilotes from Uganda. They also acquired E1b1a from Bantus expanding into their forest territories. Zulu are interesting in that they have high E2 and B. Khorasan have the very archaic A, and E1b1a from Bantus and E1b1b from the Savannah pastoral Neolithic inhabitants. Afrikaners, the Boers of Western Cape, typically European in all aspects. Canary Islands are a mix of indigenous Guanches and Spanish settlers. They have largely European Y chromosomes. Tuareg, like other Berbers, have high E1b1b, with subclade of EZ827, known as EM81, which is the prototypical Amazi marker. Last slide on Y DNA. Tubu have a very fascinating Y chromosome profile. For instance, their E1b1b is largely exclusive to them, being the rare EM78PF2186 and some EM81. They also have high T, but it's T1APF5662, and lastly they got a 1b. It overall reveals the deep Eurasian ancestry in them was largely sex-biased. Moroccans, especially Atlas Mountain Berbers, have mostly E1b1b EM81, the rest J and G. Yemenis are the peak frequency of J1 in the Arabian Peninsula, and the E1b1a in them is Southeast African from Swahili settlers. If you know your history, nearby Oman had connections with Zanzibar and Tanganyika. Egyptians in the north have E1b1b at around half, with clades like EV22 and EV65. With the remainder, a lot of that J came during the Bronze Age, from the movements of Canaanites into the Nile Delta. Sa'idis, as I was referring to prior, are largely EV12, and also T. This is why I suspect strongly the E1b1b in Somalia came with the T, and the next slide will show. Egyptians do have an Iran Neolithic component detected in Cushites as well, and the origin of Cushites lies somewhere in northeastern Sudan or southeastern Egypt. Anyhow, last but not least, Sudanese. These are the Sudanese Arab tribes such as Jalin, Batahin, Masseria, etc. So while they do have higher Arabian paternal ancestries, they are autosomally fairly similar to Nubians. They both also have the haplogroup F, which was found in Christian-era samples from the Kingdom of Kush. That closes off that section. Nice, so we have arrived at the end. As I said, I will be explaining the ancient components within the key populations I used as a reference. The HOA or Horn of Africa component as stated before is mixed. As you see, we have EA for East African, LN which means Levant Neolithic and IN, Iran Neolithic. This is what essentially makes up the HOA I used. As for the Omatic ancestry, it is based on EHG, Ethiopian hunter-gatherer, which is Mota. It also already showed signs of being admixed with a minor Levantine element. The Nilotic ancestry does itself include an older Niger-Congo contribution. I dubbed it Proto-West African, PWA. Nilotics of today have this West African mixture, some is old, and the other portion recent. So Nilotes are not really the exact representation of the pure East African component found in Horners, but they are the closest to it relatively speaking. And the EHG and EA are similar. Both derived from some kind of basal East Africans, but there was some divergence already, so it is best to separate them. For West Africa, as I showed before, some Yoruba did have Eurasian and it potentially may come from IBM sources, which is Ibero-Mauritian. We really do need much more ancient DNA from specifically the Kiphians and Tenurians, which were Saharan Africans that had Mectoid or Mecta-Afalu affinities, but are ancestral to us West African and Bantu people. Therefore, it is very likely the West African itself is a late Mesolithic to early Neolithic mix of Green Saharans and other groups. The EHG here is not really Mota-like, but related to Hadza. There is of course speculation on my part here when it comes to the ancient makeup of Western Africans, but it is interesting nonetheless. Anyhow, onto the Maghreb. EEF here stands for Anatolian farmer or early European farmers, so just like the HOA, O, N, WA, the NA1 and NA2 I showed are all anciently mixed components. The Ibero-Mauritian ancestry is the next most frequent in Berbers, then Levant Neolithic, and a portion of Proto-West African. If you remember, I mentioned the Egyptians and Berbers are distinct, and this is what I meant. Egypt is much richer in Levant Neolithic, which is Natufian and PPNB, Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, also an Iran Neolithic, which likely came during the Chalcolithic phase, and lastly Anatolian farmer and East African too. I will for sure be explaining all these migrations and movements of people in the next narrated video. But this helps to get a general idea, and I deliberately color-coded everything as it will assist with the later content, so stay tuned. Well then, that is the end of this video. Cheers to those who took the time to listen to me. I hope you managed to learn something, and I will be covering more topics like it. Thank you for paying the channel a visit. As always, like, comment, and subscribe. Peace out.